We will now begin with the first panel discussion of the conference, Indian Content and its Global Future. This panel discussion will focus on marketing Indian content to a global audience and explore ways to encourage and facilitate Indian content creation. The speakers for this discussion are Amaya Nagarajan, Arpita Das, Namita Gokhale, and Prabha Ram. And Mansi Subramaniam. This panel discussion will be chaired by Praveena Shivram, who is a writer and consultant editor of Culturama, the country's only free cultural magazine. Her primary responsibility being to ideate, plan content, implement the ideas through a strong network of Indian and expatriate writers, and oversee production for the magazine.
Hello. Thank you, Percy. Thank you all for coming here. It's the first panel discussion of this conference. May I please request everybody to keep their mobile phones on silent or switch it off if you can. So when Leonard or Leonard wrote to us about this topic for the panel discussion, one of the questions that he asked us was, is there even such a thing as Indian content? I do think that we are surrounded by many layers of Indian content. It's there in our languages, it's there in our festivals, it's there in our newspapers, the cinema we watch, the books we read, the theatre we enjoy, and it's even there in the chai wala by the roadside who tantalizes you with snakes and hot pups with tea and coffee. So yes, there most definitely is Indian content. I think the question that is going to be central to this discussion is, what are we doing with that Indian content? And how are we digesting it and shaping it so that from this morass of words and images and ideas, a pattern emerges, and hopefully that pattern is something Indian. I do think that this topic it's coming at the right time, because despite, or maybe because, we are living in the age of Google and this media blitzkrieg that we're subjected to every minute of every day, it becomes extremely important, at least for the small group assembled here, to understand, to consciously project this Indianness of the content that we have to the world, and more importantly, to understand that we are living in a country that has many Indias in this one India, and to always be conscious of that and know that no matter what we choose to write or publish, it is only one part of it, or a few at best, but never the whole picture. And we do this in the hope that somebody else might pick something else up and project that and communicate that to the world in the language they choose and the grammar they choose. I think the panel that we have here is proof of that, because each one of us is doing something totally different, very diverse, and it just shows the sheer possibility of the material that we have and all the amazing voices that can emerge from it. So we have Namita Gokhale on my extreme left. Here I'm going to refer to my notes, please. So Namita is an author, and she's a very popular author, and founder-director of the Jaipur Literary Festival and the Mountain Echoes Festival in Bhutan. She's also part of this exciting initiative called the Indian Literature Abroad, which translates Indian language books into other languages. So, and Namita is the most experienced person on this panel, so and also a publisher. Next to Namita is Prabha. Prabha is a children's writer and runs a kid-lit blog called Saffron Tree. And Prabha's concern with Indian content has got to do with how best we can bring out picture books for children, without being overtly Indian or too consciously Indian, but subtle about it, and still bring out a good product that would be exciting to somebody who doesn't necessarily live in India either. And she also is looking at using picture books in education. Next to Prabha is Manasi. Manasi Subramaniam is the commissioning editor at Karadi Tales and has several years of experience in publishing. Manasi Manasi comes with that experience of having attended several international book fairs, and it's going to be very interesting to see how Indian content is projected abroad and vice versa. On my right is Amaya Nagarajan. Amaya is she's the commissioning editor at Penguin Inked, which is the young adult imprint of Penguin. And Amaya's concern is is to use the talent that we have in India for young adult fiction and not necessarily always be importing young adult books for the Indian audience. And next to her is Arpita Das, who runs Yoda Press. She's a publisher with over 10 years of experience. Yeah. And Arpita's primary focus is on LGBT community writing, on popular culture, human rights, and that's, visuality, if I'm not mistaken. And Arpita also looks at how to give, not so much, she prefers to use the word South Asian content and how best that could be projected to a wider audience. So, and I work for a magazine, a cultural magazine. So what we thought we would start with is we have basically 3 questions that we would all address and hopefully discuss based on our individual experiences. And start with how do you even define Indian content? If there was this bag and it said Indian content, what are the things you would put into that bag to define what this term is all about? So I'll start with you, Manasi, and you could tell us what you would put into that bag.
Hi. I've actually been thinking that it might be slightly dangerous to even think of content as Indian content, because we are products of a very homogeneous society and we're very multidimensional, and the world around us is very multicultural. And I noticed this when I live in Chennai, and when I travel out of Chennai, I notice that there are differences in perceptions of Chennai, for example, or the way I perceive, say, a Goa or a Bombay or a Delhi is not necessarily how someone from there perceives that the city. So I think we are treading on slightly dangerous waters when we try and say that there is a certain type of content that is Indian content. There is no single story for India. We are such a heterogeneous society. So in that sense, I'm not sure how we even identify a certain type of content and say, let's project this as Indian content for a global future. But in children's publishing, I've learned to ask 3 questions when I'm looking at a manuscript. I'm looking at it as an Indian manuscript. 1, is it inclusive? Does it talk about ground realities and shared realities? Does it include perspectives? Is it inclusive? 2, is it authentic? Authentic, I think, is another dangerous word. But when I say authentic, is it realistic in its portrayal? Is it representing history and culture accurately? That sort of thing. And my 3rd question is it distinctive? Does it portray something unique that is not necessarily the general reality of India that is portrayed across all books? I think what I'm talking about when I say distinctive is to avoid stereotypes. That's really the simple way to put it. So these are the 3 questions we ask ourselves when we evaluate manuscripts and try to look at manuscripts as Indian or not Indian.
Sort of. You have given us something to think about. Thank you. Prabha, do you want to take this up next?
Hi, and I definitely agree with what Manasi just shared through her experience working as an editor. But as a writer and a picture book lover and an early literacy advocate, I think stories. There are many stories that we can share with our children, and picture books are such a powerful visual storytelling vehicle. And to me, content, Indian content is culturally appropriate stories which are accurate and which are not stereotypical. So I think those are 2 things that I would love. When I write for children, those are 2 things that I try to consciously look at. And stories that have not been told before. There are so many run-of-the-mill, the everyday stories that we hear, but there are so many untold stories. And how can we bring out those touchingly universal stories, not just to children within India, but even children outside, which, for instance, a story about, a tree could be, very relatable to a child growing up in an Indian culture or growing up outside. So how do we, tell stories that are touchingly universal, and how do we share stories that are culturally appropriate at the same time? So those are two things that, I always ponder. Because, a child playing outside on a rainy day, anywhere in the world, that's something that, a child can relate to. A tree is a tree anywhere in the world. So how do we create stories that are, not just as Manasi was saying, I think it's a very dangerous thing to think about Indian content and, make it exclusive and, sort of, we have these so many different voices that we can bring out and, or, not even voices, more, stereotypical things that we talk about. So I think the challenge is to move away from, stereotypes and portray stories in a subtle, minimal way where we, through picture books, I think that would be wonderful if we can get, stories, visual narratives going on for children where they can interpret, they can understand, these stories at a very broader level and not, make it just Indian alone. So that's my global point.
Yeah, that's actually something that we'll take up in the next bit of the question, where you talk about creating appropriate stories that would work. That would be read by children even abroad, because that is an important question. Because all of us have grown up reading Enid Blyton's, and none of us even know what a scone is, but we still read it and we enjoyed it, and so it would be good to see how to translate that to a child abroad. Namita, do you want to go next?
Is this working? Yeah. So first of all, I want to say that I'm one of the older people here in this conference, and there's some words, I have a privilege of being a bit sort of having my own words on this, and one word I don't like is content. It's a very flattening kind of word. It's like gender. We are people, we are not genders. And content for a writer, for other side of it, for a publisher, it's all content. These crazies create this content, But as a writer, we like to feel it is a little more. It's your life's work. You put everything. It's the essence of what is literature in the end, but the essence of our experiences, which we are trying to share. And if you must, download to the other person. But that's what reading is about. It's about sharing. Now, also the other thing about, there are two dangers here. One is with the word diversity, because diversity itself is an excuse for just about anything. It's a real, we are like that only, we are so diverse, what to do, 24 languages, what to do, north, south, what to do. And the other danger on the other side is exoticization, which really happens with, once you say Indian content, you bring on the elephants, bring on the parrots, bring on the peacocks, and forgets the urban narratives, forgets so many things. So, first, let's not call it content in my world, and let's avoid these dangers. And remember that the world is changing a lot, and there's an example I have, which is a more practical reply than all these negatives. I helped to set up something called the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. And I completely endorse Arpita's view that it has to be a South Asian literature, because there are so many overlaps of language, whether it is Tamil from Sri Lanka and here, whether it is Urdu, whether it is Nepali, which is an Indian language. So this is South Asian content we are talking about, South Asian literatures. And the DSC Prize was for South Asian literature, and the way we went around it was that anybody, it wasn't about passports, anybody of any ethnicity, if they were writing about the region. And it could be in any language in translation. And I think that was quite a good thing. But so much of so-called Indian content might well be produced. Canada has the greatest Gurmukhi writing and also publishing. Is one of the few places you don't get so much Gurmukhi publishing in Punjab as you get in Canada of the original script. So it's a very difficult question to answer. And then one answer which always seems to work is that in 2002 we did a festival. I'm going back to history all the time, but we did this incredible festival of Indian literature in Neemrana. And I can never forget what Yuval Ananthamurthy said when asked the same sort of question in a panel. And he said, in his inimitable way, he said, whether the Mahabharata or the Ramayana have been read and translated, that is South Asian literature. And that is South Asian, that's not Indian. And he said this is not in a culturally national way. It's just that these are the two texts that have gone into every language and being adapted locally by every language. And then I remember there was a person called Richard Cruster, a very bright writer from Bangalore. And he got up and he said, but my narrative is Bugs Bunny, and how can you interrupt? But in the end, it does come down quite a lot to the core material of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Not being chauvinistic, it's just there in the subconscious of this subcontinent or this South Asia. And we did a beautiful seminar in October last year in Udaipur with the Science Academy, where we got people from each of the 24 Indian languages to talk about what is a classic, what is the greatest thing written in your language in the last 100 years, 2 or 3 landmarks. And it's not surprising, every single language came up with a reinterpretation of the Mahabharata, including Manipur. And so at the end of it, we felt pretty cheated. We said we were doing a seminar on contemporary classics and we've come back with the Mahabharata. I mean, this is like a no-win. So these are my initial reactions to this.
So Arpita, I'll bring you in here now because we have expanded our horizons and gone to South Asian content. So yeah, I have. So you can take this up. I think Amyan get to go last. I have the last word.
The last word.
No, I think with Yoda Press, I can only talk about. I mean, there were almost 10 years of publishing before Yoda Press, but I would like to only talk about Yoda Press. I think when we think of our titles or our lists there, we think of 3 words, more or less. We think of South Asian, we think of alternative, which I suppose many of us are thinking of, avoiding stereotypes, trying to take the off the beaten track. We try to think of it as those areas and those concerns which mainstream publishing is not addressing the way we would like them addressed. Obviously, our LGBT list, the sexuality series, is of particular importance there. And the third word I always think of is non-fiction, because I am committed to non-fiction, and I think there is tremendous potential there, while all the hoopla is about fiction, even now. There's tremendous potential there, and a few of us who mined it, few of us who explored it, are even more excited now because I think there are many, many more avenues now to get to bring that kind of attention to non-fiction as well. Ultimately, of course, my own interest is always with the essay as a genre, and I think the essay is doing better than ever now, book length or otherwise. I think that, I love reading fiction, and I'm a great sort of follower of Indian and international fiction, but it's just that I think over the years of doing Yoda Press, there is a certain activist, dissent-based element that is crept into the Yoda Press list, and we find that is very, very effectively communicated through creative nonfiction.
Well, apparently the mic doesn't want me to have the last word.
Hello?
Okay, the proverbial last word. When I commission, so the problem with YA as a genre is it's not a genre, it's an age group, right? So all sorts of genres get commissioned to YA, but I do notice there's a sort of a trend. We end up doing a lot of really commercial stuff, which automatically makes, for me, a different kind of problem than perhaps other people on this panel might face. Because for me, it's not so much about, what do I put in the bag of Indian content? It's more like, what can I put in the bag of Indian teenagers will read? Which is a kind of a different bag. Because the Indian content that I might produce may be written by, some guy in Gurgaon, but it has to talk about people in places and in ways that are not that Indian. And if they are Indian, they have to be very subtly Indian, right? So, of course, it helps that I agree very much with Mansi that what is Indian in the first place? Is it plowing the fields? Is it working in a call center? Is it speaking Tamil? Is it whatever? There are so many things around it. Yeah, so it's very difficult to interpret. So at the end of the day, India is what? It can be, Indian content can be content written by someone with an Indian passport. But there are a lot of people who were born with Indian passports who don't have them anymore, for example. It can be something written about India and people with Indian passports, as it were. But that doesn't really work either. So I think that I would say Indian content at the end of the day becomes what people in India want to read. That's how it works for me.
Hello. Okay, Amaya, I'm going to, Indian content becomes about what people in India want to read. This is something we battle with every month when we produce this magazine, which is a cultural magazine, which is about India, but it's not what Indian people want to read. It's more to do with the expat audience that's coming into the country to live and work here. So we are always in this danger zone of cliches, of stereotypes, of battling questions that ask us, can I ride an elephant to school, or if a mosquito bites me, will I die? And we are battling with these every single day, and to still go beyond that and give something that remains true to what Indian content is all about. So for me, it would be roots. I think it's very important to know who we are before we do whatever we want to do. So it comes back to the question that Manasi and Amaya were talking about of what is Indian, who is Indian. It also connects to what Namita mentioned of how it's all the it boils down to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Like all our stories are from there. Whether it's the books or the movies or whatever it is, you can trace them all back to those two epics. And even though there are today religious connotations attached to it, if you take away all of that, it still boils down. It goes back to the two big epics of India. And the second would be evolution, because we are changing as a country. So the whole concept of what Indian is also changing. And here I think we are like young adults, because we're just rushing ahead and believing that everything that we do is right and everybody else is wrong. And you need to address that as well when you're looking at content, when you're looking at writing or publishing, to see the changing tastes, so to speak, and not judge it. The discussion is not so much about is it good or bad, but just that it's there. So accept it and go ahead.
Are we allowed
sorry.
to?
No, we have a question answer session in the end, so you keep your questions and we will come back to it. You can make a comment. Go ahead.
Okay, so the only thing I did want to say is the idea of our roots going back to the Mahabharata and the Ramayana is a very strong one. But the other thing is, like all epic tales, those are stories that happen everywhere. So everybody's roots go back to their own version of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, right? Which then brings us back to the square one.
Right, exactly.
I think this leads into the next bit of what is it that you want to project to the audience, whether they're Indian or whether they're global, or whether they're the global audience living in India or the other way around. Whoever your audience is, what is it? It boils down to what your perception of India is, and what part of that perception you want to communicate to the world, and how you do it. So it does have a lot to do with the way you market it. I do believe that it's not enough to just have a great story. You need to know how to get it out there. So if there is, for Amaya, how would you had this comment of how there are young adults who won't even pick up a book if there's an Indian author's name on it.
Yeah, when we go and talk to people in bookstores, and the people who own bookstores, especially there's one in Delhi called Eureka, which is a children's and YA bookstore, and they tell us that people don't want to look at a book kids. They don't want to look at the book if it has an Indian name on it. I've actually considered asking some of my authors to write under pseudonyms that are sort of vaguely nationality vague, but most people don't want to do that because they've written this book and they want their name on it. So it becomes a problem because I think the reason is essentially it boils down to the fact that perhaps there's some, of course, there's the appeal of the import, the Star TV version, e-books, all the stuff that gets imported because it's true. If you look at the top books that sell every week, the only young adult books on there are imports, always. So it's partly that, but I think it's also partly a little, like I feel like there's a tradition of writing for youngsters in India that is slightly overtly didactic, which makes it problematic for them as well.
So I'm Manasi and Prabha. Both of you have, Prabha has lived in the US for several years, and that's how Sapentry came about. And Manasi has represented Indian content, if I can say that. Now I'm afraid to abroad. So I would love to hear from both of you on what kind of perceptions that you had to deal with, and how do you deal with those perceptions? Is there any one way to do it?
So when I was in the US, audible?
Yeah.
No, there was always this constant craving to offer India to my children. So I would, go out and not just India, South Asian voice, as Namita and Arpita were mentioning. I think that's a broader term I would like to use too. So there was this urge to how do I portray South Asia to my children, and also give them a global perspective. When they read, not just get bogged down and tied to certain stories. So because I do believe in the dangers of offering single stories and exoticization that Namita mentioned. So that way I felt that was the time when I felt I needed to share the wonderful publishers that were doing some great work in India, like Tulika and Tara and Karadi. So those were all like refreshing content that was coming out back in 2000, early 2003, 4, 5 time. And so the blog that I just had started then was an attempt to share those books that I wanted to share with other parents. So it was just a very new thing, and people were craving to see those titles, and they were all like so surprised that there were so many such wonderful books out of India. And so I do feel very happy having played a small role in bringing Indian content in the US.
But you did mention that there were Indians living abroad who were looking for it, and not so much
yes.
Americans perhaps who were looking at
See,
these
there was another group of writers I felt very strongly attached to, which was this whole South Asian writers of Indian origin writing in the US for children. So Pooja Makijani, Uma Krishnaswamy, and Rukhsana Khan. So fiercely independent, in their voices, and even the kind of stories like Partition, for instance, as its story was offered, and how many of us grew up with such stories. So those were Chachaji's Cup, one book by Uma Krishnaswamy, which I loved, was about this little boy's grandfather brings a broken piece of china where from that belonged to his mother, who had moved from during the partition time. So it was just such a refreshing story, and the beautiful relationship between the grandson and the grandfather. So those are the kind of stories my heart totally beats for. Content or stories that you don't hear about every day. I know our roots are in Mahabharata and Ramayana, but again, that's a very, very big stereotype, which I don't actually quite agree, and I don't really think it applies to all Indians too. So, but in terms of content, I'm always looking at interesting stories that we've not heard of in the mainstream, and untold hidden stories.
I'd just like to clarify here that I'm not rooting for the Mahabharata or the Ramayana as base stories in a cultural way, but it's just how they do keep turning up. I was just reading Manjula Padmanabhan's absolutely brilliant new book of stories, and there again, surprise, what is it? But the same old stories retold. So please, whenever you want to criticize the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, don't look at me, go ahead.
I was clueless. Growing up,
I'm not taking a position.
No, sorry about that. But really, growing up, I think my roots were not Mahabharata and Ramayana based. But but now I'm definitely craving to understand and read, so many different perspectives on, the Mahabharata. So I think it varies, but going back to the content and stories, I think anything that's refreshingly new and not heard before, I think that would be the kind of stories that I would love to offer my children, and also in writing for children. So I mean, two of my books, one was set in Assam and the first one was set in Gujarat, about the Asiatic lions and the Maldharis, living with the lions in the Gir forest. So you don't, these are not your everyday stories. So that's what, multiculturalism and India is all about to me.
Manasi, tell us what it is like when you meet somebody, I don't know, a German publisher who looks at Karadi Tales.
So this is a very interesting question. I've been representing our books at the International Book Fairs for 4-5 years now, and we've had some very interesting experiences. So I'll tell you a funny story that happened. We did this absolutely lovely book called Monkeys on a Fast. It's about this group of monkeys that live near a temple, and the priest one day decides that all the monkeys are just getting too fat because the people who come to the temple are feeding them. So he tricks all the monkeys into going on a fast, because the people are going on a fast for Ekadashi. And it's such a charming, funny story about how these monkeys are unable to go on a fast. And there was this one publisher from the UK who read the book and loved the story and loved the illustrations, and she was interested in publishing it in the UK. And as talks progressed, they were testing it out in their market, and they came back to us and said, "It's a wonderful story, we love it, but it's very politically incorrect to say fat." And I was like, "What?" So ultimately, when they did the book, they eliminated the word fat entirely from the text, and I don't remember what word they went with. But this is the sort of thing that we're not used to this level of political correctness, I think, in India, and or that level of politeness even. And there was this another really charming story that we did called the Wednesday Bazaar, and it's about this little girl in a small town who goes to a bazaar, and she gets lost and she gets separated from her mother. And all the people in the bazaar hold hands and form a circle until she finds the mother. And there was a publisher in the US who was looking at it, and again, similar story, loved it, and then she came back to us and she said, "But the thing is, in the US, we tell our children not to go ask strangers for help." They're all taught not to talk to strangers, and we are such a community-centric kind of society that, as a child, when I got lost, I was perfectly comfortable walking up to a stranger and saying, "I can't find my mother, can you help me?" And they would, because that's the kind of community we grew up in. Obviously things are changing now, but these are the sorts of differences that we find, and especially with children's books, these are the sorts of troubles that we find. And I agree with Ameya when she says that Indian children are reluctant to pick up books by Indians. But this again, there are so many problems that emerge from this trend, in that, something as simple as, we were talking about picture books. When you look at picture books, even the old fairy tales like your Snow Whites and Cinderellas, you somehow, after reading them, you learn to associate beauty with Snow White skin, or Cinderella blonde hair, or a certain type of physique. And the effect that this can have on a child's self-worth in India is devastating. The kind of self-image and body image that you grow up with in India, I think often the effects of these books can be devastating. And for this, if nothing else, I think we should promote Indian content in India. And now that there are so many expats in India or Indians living abroad, I think it is very important to promote Indian content, well, for children and for adults, both in India and abroad.
Namita, you said you wanted to take it up.
No, there were just a few points. I thought, I scribbled and I will not be able to make sense of my scribbles in a little while. So, what I wanted to say was that what you said really beautifully illustrated the idea of conflicting parochialisms. There's the parochialism of the children. There's the parochialism of the children who only want to read about little blonde babies. And there's the parochialism of those cultures outside which are not able to accept other things. And the whole point of literature is to be able to break into these. this the global content and reaching out to the global. I think somewhere in India we are not very confident when we reach out. I mean, we're a billion plus people. We're the largest book market, and yet whenever I've seen in Frankfurt or anywhere we tread out, we are so apologetic about this. And I think we forget that one of our greatest assets is the diasporic Indians across the world who really can spread the word. There's an example I'd like to give. I was in Mauritius just now, and there's a wonderful writer called Ananda Devi. Now, Ananda Devi is a Telugu. She speaks Telugu and she speaks French, no English. And it's such an Anglophone world. It's surprising that she writes in French. In France, she's considered one of the greatest writers of her generation. Published, accepted, but no English publisher, Rupa, did one translation, but she's just not known here, simply because the Anglophone world has the dominant power in the publishing business, quite disproportionate to their real numbers. And why do we never think when we look at global content? We don't really think. We put it in, we tick the boxes, but it's never the Spanish market, it's never the Arabic market, it's never the Chinese market, the French, because they try so hard. So somewhere there, it's a mindset of ours, which is actually a colonial, very long-lasting colonial hangover, that we really only think of the Anglophone market, which is shrinking. I mean, the publishers outside India, the big names, they are really not what they used to be anymore. This is the time for us to seek the advantage to reach out to Africa, where we have such a natural market in terms of both publishing. So I mean, I'm not trying to give gyan, but what I have tried to do here, and Jaipur Literature Festival has proved that we are as good as anybody anywhere out there in the world if we just stand tall and assert ourselves. So there was a project called Indian Literature Abroad, of which I was the member secretary. And it was a very, very ambitious project, which sadly took a bit of battering from the Culture Ministry. But we got it back online, and we just handed it over to the Sahitya Academy. And I'm still associated with it. And I'm proud to say that this year we will be giving out ELA, not we, but ELA will be giving out, they'll be subsidizing 10 to 12 translations to begin with, and I'm sure once this finds its feet, the National Book Trust also subsidizes translations, and really good translations to the rest of the world is where one can find a good market.
Arpita, I'd like you to specifically talk about the kind of South Asian content that you deal with is controversial on its own ground, and not perhaps doesn't even have much of a market in India either. If I might be wrong, but how do you sort of strike that balance of being a publisher, so it's a business, and also dealing with content that you feel strongly about, also in the Indian market and the global market? How do you strike the balance?
I think first of all, one of the things that we've always thought of when we've worked on our titles and our lists is not that we want to project or portray anything, but that we want to connect. Because we were very aware of this, that we're picking up issues like popular culture, sexuality, urbanism, and the potential was immense in terms of connecting with many other countries of the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. And we didn't want to let go of that. And this was something that was part of the agenda from the beginning, really. And I think one of the happiest moments in my publishing life was a few years ago when we'd done a book called Because I Have a Voice, which is an anthology on writings on queer politics, which has become a constant seller and is always in print since then. This was brought out in 2005 by us. And a friend called me from a bookstore in Ghana saying that they found the copy there. And I really felt that, that was a great moment for all of us at Yoda Press. And speaking of Africa, Namita, I mean, recently there's a book that we've done, which again another book on the LGBT list called A Little Book on Men. It's a graphic book on Indian men. Obviously after 16 December its sales have shot up, which is a good thing. But it had done really well even before. And recently we've had a show of interest from a South African publisher who wants to buy rights. And of course, these are problems to do with masculinity, to do with domestic violence or to do with how we're planning our cities, how cities and crime are related. These are things that, you know, we can talk about. We can talk across borders of countries and continents even. And I think we were always very aware of that. At the moment we're talking about developing content, not about reaching the market. So in developing the content. The other thing that I would like to say is that within India, when you say that there is a tough market within India for books of this sort, my sense always from the beginning, my instinct, which is now, of course, after 10 years of doing Yoda Press established, is that no, there is a market and a very, very dynamic market. But I like to think of it as a leadership. But at that point, it was, you know, it was just perhaps on the net, online, or it was ambivalent, particularly for something like LGBT. Because, for instance, I remember when we did our first couple of sexuality books, you had a good bookstore story, so you named the bookstore. I have a bad bookstore story, so I will name them. This particular bookstore, very well known in Delhi, refused to keep this because I have a because I have a voice book saying "Hum aisi kitabein nahi rakhte," we don't keep such books, as if it was pornography. But anyway, and I keep pornography at Yoda King, frankly. And we sent 25 people in there, friends and other people from the LGBT community, asking for the book, you know, and sure enough, since that day, that book has always been sorry, I was going to name the that which will not be named, but I almost didn't. She's picked up, but should no. And the other thing, I mean, of course there are. I mean, one is always working around this challenge of trying to, you know, define is a terrible word. Trying to, you know, sort of articulate what you're doing, because you're trying to do something which is alternative. But I have a distributor, for instance, when we first started our LGBT list, they called me and said, "Madam, aapki sex ki kitabein kab aayegi?" And I first start with, not sex, it's sexuality, there's a big difference. How sex ki kitabein kab aayegi? But I soon figured that they're selling them a lot. So what the heck?
So you said we're still developing content and we then go to the. So isn't it connected that you develop content based on your market, and so you need to define who your market is, because that's what for us at the magazine, we know who our market is. We know it's expats coming and living in India. So if we have Indians reading the magazine, also great, that's a bonus. But the sensibility with which we write is always that it's somebody who doesn't know India. So we will still explain the difference between Brahmin, Brahma and Brahman. So, because maybe an Indian would know it, but not an expat. So we do still go with that because that's our market. But it's a bonus for us that there are lots of Indians like NRIs who are coming back and who want to touch base with their roots, who don't know either, who are picking it up. So it's always connected, isn't it?
Yeah, it's connected, of course. But you know, you must understand, with our list, there was a lot of uncertainty to begin with. We really had nothing to fall back upon in terms of market information. Because, for instance, sexualities, when we started in 2005, I mean, I think there may have been 2 books which are really well known from Penguin, and of course the wood text for me is not Mahabharata. For that list, the wood text for me is Salim Kidwai and Ruth Vanita's big book on same-sex love. You know, that's the wood text for LGBT lists. So, but it was very little. There was very little.
Mahabharata has it.
Of course, it's a but yeah, no, I mean, you know, my lists, my interests, I think, always push me to go anti-classic. But of course, you can't go anti-classic. It will only go that far, and then you're sort of back going. You know, it's like it's kind of. But I just feel that I think you do start, however, you do start from your context, obviously. And for us, our context was always South Asian. So what we did, what we did do in terms of practical, trying to find out, you know, whether we were on the right track or not, is basically trying to make as many connections as possible across South Asia. whether it was through authors networks, the university networks, seminars, conferences. I think we did about 2 years of this. And I must say that I used up a lot of the Oxford University Press time and salary for that. But, and I'm proud of it. I think by the end of it, there was definitely a sense that there is a market for this sort of this kind of list in South Asia for sure. And then from second year onwards, obviously we also started saying, no, we're looking further than that. We're looking at Latin America, we're looking at Africa, and we'd like to make connections there as well. We actually never initially looked to the West. It's only now that we're kind of also looking at the West, and because there's been a lot of automatic show of interest, I suppose, because we're doing things like sexuality.
So, Amaya, with you as somebody working for Penguin, one of the biggest publishers, yeah. So the dynamic must be totally different. And so what kind? Because we are talking only about young adult fiction because that's your forte. So what kind of is there even a question of striking a balance, because you've sort of commercially already made it? So does that question even arise?
Well, commercially made it might have a meaning, but you have to stay made. Like you've made it, you're Penguin, everyone wants, to be paid more money, everyone wants you to do these huge marketing campaigns, and you have to keep going, right? You can't just be like, acha, ho gaya, my bad, khatam. It doesn't work like that. So that's part of it. Yes, there is a lot of pressure, like market-wise. In some ways, I imagine everyone feels that you guys must feel it like crazy, but in some ways you have more freedom than we do, because there isn't some guy sitting in New York looking at a bottom line, right? So that's part of the problem in some ways over here. But I guess the thing is that you can do so many things, you want to do so many things, but you have to pick a place where you want to start. I mean, with you guys, you picked a place where you wanted to start, and then you went on to look at Latin America and Africa, and the rest is following as it were. We have to choose a slightly different path, I guess. But what I try to do though is, I understand there's a certain kind of book that the market wants. There's a certain kind of book that's going to make the numbers. And that's great. And that doesn't mean it's a bad book. I'm actually personally a big fan of commercial fiction, so that's fine. But I do occasionally try and sneak in a book there that I really love. Like, we have this graphic novel coming out next year in April that I really love. The graphic novels in India are notorious for doing badly, right? I mean, the imports do well, but they're actually not speaking to young adults so much as people who have their first jobs and big paychecks and like things like that. There's the occasional one that works, but I mean, generally speaking, graphic novels are notoriously difficult to push. But this one I just couldn't resist. It was so cute, and it's this hilarious story that makes fun of all these filmy narratives that we all live with constantly, and it's so cutely done. And I was like, no, we have to do this. And so every so often, or in April this year, we had this book written interestingly by a Canadian woman who's not Indian at all, about a young girl whose mother dies, a Sikh girl. They're settled in Canada, and then she and her father come back to India, and they end up in Delhi at the 84 riots. So, which is a really, complex, layered theme, and it was a very complex book. And it's not going to. I know it's not going to sell 10,000 copies, right? But it's still there. So I guess the way to walk that line is, you have to make some compromises. You can't sign every book you love that may not do so well, and you also don't try to still sign occasionally a book or two that will do well. One thing though, actually it's very interesting that you said Latin America and Africa, because culturally they're so much more similar to us that I can see your Fat Monkey story would be perfectly acceptable in Latin America, like completely.
Just to add to what Amaya was saying, I think the trouble with marketing children's books to children is that we're not in fact marketing to children. We're marketing to parents and teachers and librarians, and they don't know what children want to read. I mean, I barely know what children want to read. I'm not sure that we're ever going to get the opportunity to market directly to the people who are going to be reading our books. And so you have to, I think, walk on this tricky line where you're saying it's a kind of book, but when the children actually read it, it's a completely different kind of book. So
And you're hoping the parents don't read it.
yeah.
No, but to be fair, I'm luckier than you as far as that goes because, most of I am marketing to 15 to 18 to 21 year olds and they kind of buy their own books. So,
This is one of the challenges that we face with the magazine is how do you keep that space sacred, the space that you create for content, how do you keep it sacred and not succumb to the market pressures, but still be conscious that you do need the market to even have a space in the first place. So how do so that because for us we struggle with it every month, and I don't know if we're even in the right track. We seem we're doing what we think is right for us, what feels right, and we're continuing along that track. But it is important to see how that content is even allowed to evolve, because many times it's not. Because many times you're told this is what is needed, just do it, and you just have to, because sometimes you can't. You have to pick your battles really. So
I think my extremely immediate reaction was that I don't think you should keep anything sacred, personally speaking. But
I think it's a variation on what Amir said, which is that I think the market is sacred as well, and the market is no, but the market as in I think also as the writer, the way I mean it is also not so different from the point of view of the writer. I think the market is what's giving me what I want to publish, like you said earlier yourself, the connect. And I find that connect is limitless at the moment as far as my interests are concerned. I think I've only really scratched the surface. So I feel I can just keep going. I don't sense. We did this book not thinking the West would be interested in it at all. That was never the even not any part of one's imagination. A book on what it means. It was called Muslim Portraits, and it essentially took. We approached 12 anthropologists and told them, drop your jargon, don't talk about your area of interest, and just give us a chapter, an essay each on one Muslim person you've worked with in your field, like a biopic. And we did this book called Muslim Portraits, with these 12 fascinating, portraits from Kashmir to Andamans. And the next thing we know, we were approached by Indiana University Press, and they want to buy world rights. And that's what I meant when I said that by default, then we started realizing we can also sell our books to the West. So, my sense is that the market is giving me a lot, so I don't look at it as two different things.
Rita, do you want to add to the question of how to strike the balance, because you're a writer and a publisher?
I think there are those who say that the market is king, there are those who say content is king, but I really think all of us have the capacity for self-expression. Some do it better, some do it worse, but when that moment comes, that's really the prerogative of the market. Nobody can control it. And the way to negotiate it is to have complete sympathy with the market. Don't say, oh, the market is bad. That's a bad judgment. You have to respect the market, because that is what people want to read, and they buy it, they vote with their feet, they vote with their wallets. And, saying I'm a misunderstood genius, it's not going to help you much. There are two examples I'll give you of this. But yet the point is to challenge it. And to go back to something like the Jaipur Literature Festival, I was given always, market is king, nobody wants to hear about Indian writers, I was told. And yet, if we bring in a Santhali writer, she gets the same audience and attention there, because it is how she's positioned. So in the market, the trick is to position it in a way that makes it accessible. The Dalit writers, I was told it's just tokenism to bring in Dalit writers, but the first year we did the Dalit writing thing, my co-director William Dalrymple, he said, Namita, it's easy to get Salman Rushdie and not get Salman Rushdie, and get thousands of people here. But to get the same thousands of people to listen to Om Prakash Valmiki is a different story. And it's about positioning it within the market with confidence and with integrity. And I think that is really the trick. But at the same time, if you look at somebody like Amish Tripathi, you know, I mean, I watched the Amish Tripathi saga over the years. I was part of the people who first saw the manuscript, and I said, "Oh, will this work?" And it didn't. And now we, at Yatra Books, which I'm associated with, we co-publish his books in Hindi. And I can say he has done something really significant, which is that he has shown the strength of the Indian market. He has shown what the Indian sales are capable of. So it's a general picture of knowing what your product is and where in that marketplace you want to tag it. And challenge the market, always challenge the market.
I also want to add that there are different kinds of markets too, because when I write and when I see my book get selected by the CBSE board, they're actually looking at classrooms and school library markets. So that's one market that I'm really conscious of when I write. Will it reach children? Will it reach school libraries? So I think we do have to think about those environments too when we talk about markets. And I think it'll happen. I mean, if a book is real and it speaks with integrity, and I think it'll automatically happen whether in India or outside. I think it will. It should. So
Actually, I kind of disagree there, because I think that with the way that we are all bombarded with content, right? Use that hateful word. Constantly, everywhere, every time you walk into a shop, and every book starts looking the same, because it has to have a commercial look. It has to have an international commercial look. It has to have a literary look. I mean, this is the kind of discussions we actually have in our office, where we have cover meetings and we see all the options and we're like, no, that looks like non-fiction. What does that mean? It's a picture, right? How does it look like non-fiction? But it does. So the point is that I think you can have a book that is written with all the integrity and all the poise in the world, but if you don't put it in the right bookshelf, in the shop, it's never going to go. I mean, just not going to happen. So, and that's the thing, like, you have to respect the market, like Mamata said.
But that's what I was asking, is when you know that, and when you know, it's just that you know both sides of it so well, you're always forced to pick a side.
Actually, that's the thing, I don't think you do. Because that's the thing. I guess my point is that you can't always stay in the middle. But sometimes you can pick a book up and you can go and you can say, you go to your sales guy and you say, listen, please, you got to push this, and then you go and you tell the marketing person, do this, and you go and you go and you say, give me the distributor, I'll talk to them, you go to the bookshops, you talk to the book, you can do it. But it requires
It
great
does,
personal commitment.
It's wonderful when you work with a small publisher, because they aren't really thinking too much about sales in a big way as the big publishers do.
Well,
And
sales
it's the kind of
benefit-
market too they're talking about.
I know, but sales kind of benefit the author too, so you want your publisher to be thinking about sales.
Right.
We do think on sales. We just pretend we do. But no, I think the only thing I want to add here, actually I have two things. No, but the only thing I really want to add here is that I think the way I look at it, I mean, I really wouldn't think of it as sides, and then I also wouldn't. I mean,
sides, but just as two very distinct energy forces that's just pulling you in two different directions.
but they're not two different directions, because the way I always try to break it down for myself is that ultimately the market is that reader who wants to read my book, and if I have respect for that reader, who will then become a cumulative readership, which is why I always tell my editors and my interns that, and we do have a few, I mean, I know it's not just me, I mean, there are a few others, even though it's very small, that think readership, not market, then you'll have more respect, and I think that does help. I mean, that's it.
I think Manasi wanted to just add something, and then you're fine.
I was just going to say that we're a country with 1 billion people. I mean, even a small minority is a very large market.
Right. I think. Go ahead.
No, I've done a little homework and I didn't